Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Charge, your source to stay plugged into collegiate esports alongside Box Turtle. My name is Bearlight. Today, we're covering CollegeCOD in the season as well.
That's right. We are joined by special guest IHOLDSHIFT to break down the CCL regular season and look ahead to the playoff review. We will also have all of your bracket links as well as where you can keep up with the playoffs down in the description below. But for now, let's get into it. The CCL playoffs are about to kick off, and after an exciting season, it's time to take a look back at some of the competition to see who has the best chance of making a run in the playoffs. Now, joining me today on this episode is a very special guest, commentator for all things Call of Duty at all levels, our friend IHOLDSHIFT. Welcome to the show, buddy. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, I'm doing good, man. All things, all levels is a little overreaching, but I'll take the compliment.
I'm just looking into the future, you know? But I do have a quick question for you before we start. So one of my favorite things about esports at the collegiate level is how close the talent is to the professional level sometimes, compared to, of course, traditional sports, right, where there's that massive gap. In Call of Duty, do you think that there is a large gap between college teams or even, challenger teams compared to those at the highest level in challengers or in the pros?
The gap between the high level of challengers and the pro league, as we've learned in the last 2 weeks, is marginal if there is one at all. A lot of the top challengers players obviously are getting picked up like wildfire right now. When you transition that conversation over to the collegiate scene, it falls in a different sphere because right now some of the best teams that are out there in the CCL are largely represented with players that are sitting somewhere in the top 32, top 64 of challengers. So there definitely is a larger gap, especially if you're considered the collegiate scene to the professional scene. And a lot of that just comes down to the goals and aspirations of the players in the first place. Like imagine if Simp did not play professional Call of Duty and instead was in the CCL because he wanted to go to college at 18. Different levels, different kind of, I think, passions when it comes down to what they want to do with their careers overall. So there definitely is a larger gap between what you see in the collegiate scene versus what you see in the pro scene. But there are a handful of players that are represented in the challengers scene that are doing pretty well, to be fair.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right. I mean, there's path to pro players in and around the college space like crazy. But again, man, we're super excited to have you on the show today. Let's just go ahead and get right into our coverage. We are, of course, finished with the regular season. We have our region qualifier teams slated. And we have our playoff teams for the most part at this point, at least, those ones that are auto-qualified. So as the regular season has officially come to a close, you've had the pleasure to watch, if not analyze, almost all of these teams at some level to a certain extent. So what is the biggest surprise you have seen so far? Is there a team that stands out to you throughout the regular season?
Oh, there's a handful. I mean, it's actually really interesting because we had 180 teams this year. And I would be lying if I said I knew everything about every single one of them. But at the top, I think we all as a staff were looking at the amount of teams that we had, and we would said, oh, there's no way someone's going to go undefeated this year. There's just too many teams, too many talented players that are coming in for the first time this year. And we were wrong in those predictions. There are a handful. There are 5 teams that still have yet to lose. And of course that will change once we get into playoffs naturally. But that was surprising to us. There were a couple of squads overall. Actually, I think it's more than 5. There's more like 7 teams that haven't lost yet. But we were surprised by that statistic. I think largely when we were looking through how we were dividing the divisions and the regions up in whole, we thought that there was no way that someone was going to get through their region completely undefeated. And that was obviously not the case. So it's been really interesting kind of to see that kind of unfold. That's been, I think, the most surprising thing overall is the fact that as you go from region to region, there in every single one of our regions, someone was undefeated. Essentially, we're still waiting to see 1-2 of the teams play each other, or what happens there. But in every single region, the team that finished on top of the region finished undefeated, which was surprising overall to us. So I think as far as the biggest surprise factor for the CCL in this season was the fact that it was still very much so top heavy. And granted, again, there were some regions that were easier than others. But with that, I think there were a couple of shining stars. The teams that come out of Ottawa, I mean, they went through and they recruited challengers players that are sitting in the top 32, top 16 occasionally every now and again. And they're obviously doing very, very well. But then beyond that, you also have some teams that have really surprised us for the opposite region. There's a team out there from last season, High Point University came through. I don't even think they won a single series. And now they've only lost 2 series, and they're looking really primed to be in playoffs and maybe potentially make a run. They're one of my top 25 teams, personally speaking, that they're playing really, really well. So seeing schools kind of start from last season and then get increasingly better throughout this year has been also very surprising.
Yeah, well, I mean, speaking of undefeated teams, one of the stat lines that stuck out to me the most is specifically the runs that Ottawa Gold and Concord Maroon have had so far. Obviously,
Sure.
of course, both teams are undefeated. Both have yet to drop a map and have managed to keep opposing teams to under 100 points on hardpoint maps and barely giving away one round on search and destroy maps. So, of course, we've seen these teams outperform opponents, in and out of competitions before. But what do you think is the biggest contributing factor to such dominating performances? Is it the Challenger League players?
For Ottawa Gold, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to say who's their better team overall until they play each other. But yeah, that's definitely one of the biggest reasons for sure. Now, that said, I think Ottawa Black technically had a harder division than Ottawa Gold did, which is why you're seeing a couple of maps, be lost by Ottawa Black necessarily compared to, a single map, I think is what they lost. So, I mean, whatever. It's kind of is what it is. Concord, kind of the same thing. Their region was kind of a cakewalk. They didn't really play anybody too difficult. I mean, High Point was like the only team in their region that was really all that great, and Penn State as well. And that Penn State team is not nearly as good as I think they were last year.
Yeah.
So those are some contributing factors to be sure. But, for Concord, they fall into a world that is separate from the Ottawa discussion because although all four of the players that play for Concord are very talented, none of them are really pursuing the challenger scene at large, at least as a collective, right? I mean, Ottawa Gold and Ottawa Black, they have a couple of duos, trios, and at one point in time, I think all four players from one of the teams was playing together as a collective squad in challengers. So that's where things kind of differ. But I think for Concord, they're looking at their university as their main focus, and challengers is just kind of there if they want to try to pursue it, maybe. But they work collectively as a school, at least so what seems when it you're talking to those players and stuff like that. So their focus is the CCL, whereas, the players for Ottawa Gold and Ottawa Black just happen to be a collection of players that are focused on challengers. So I don't know what that really says about the chem or, how things kind of function as far as the mentality for the squad, but I have to imagine that plays some sort of a factor.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, especially those guys looking to just dominate performances in and out, no matter what level they're playing at, I'm sure. So, of course, we're looking at the top 15 teams. You mentioned before that High Point is a team that for you last season, they made a dramatic shift this season into being included in your personal top 25 teams.
Yeah.
But is there anyone else? Obviously, there's familiar faces. There's Ottawa, there's Humber, there's Purdue, there's, Cal State Long Beach. But is there anyone else in that top 15 to 20 that you look at and go, okay, wow, where did they come from?
I actually am going to go and talk about that Cal State Long Beach team because one of the players for that squad is Zuri, and he I think he actually won the 2v2 gunfight tournaments that happened last year. It was supposed to be the city circuits. He was either in the finals or he won. I don't 100% recall. But that was really cool because for me, when we were initially introduced to the 2v2 gunfight city circuit, it was supposed to be held just on the local environments that the home series were happening at, eventually moved online. I always thought that was a really cool way to kind of bridge the gap between the casual audience and the pursuit of playing something more officially competitive. Last year 5v5, this year 4v4. And I thought using gunfight was a really cool way to kind of to make up that divide and kind of maybe bridge an opening to see players maybe try to pursue. It's like, hey, I'm actually doing really well in this gunfight league. Maybe I could do it competitively.
Yeah.
Now, granted, last year we have the gunfight tournament system built into the game, and we don't really see much gunfight love whatsoever in Cold War this year, so that doesn't exist so much anymore. But I thought it was really cool to kind of see his story go from, hey, this guy, 2v2, incredible. Now he's all of a sudden signing up for the CCL. Maybe the next step is he's trying to get more involved with trying to find a challengers team. I think that's really, really cool. So to see kind of him alongside the other three guys in that squad that are all very talented do as well as they have, I think is really indicative of the fact that there is some path to pro being established. Now, granted, obviously pro is not really the word to be used here because we're talking college, but it's still cool to see there to be a door opened up where he goes from gunfight into the competitive sphere more regularly. So that was probably my favorite story overall. I would say largely. And then outside of that, I think it's just talking about the fact that teams did go out and kind of recruit and players that were very prevalent in the challenger scene from the last year were looking at the CCL like, hey, let me go apply to schools that have decent COD teams. That was kind of the thing. So I won't say there's like a specific team story, more as just the population of players overall has kind of more taken my attention this year.
Yeah, and I mean, Cal State actually, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they finished in the money in the last TESPA 10K for Modern Warfare.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
And that was the one where it was Ottawa versus Ottawa in the final, if I'm not mistaken. So, but when we're looking back at the regular season, was there a specific match that you look back on, whether that be for storylines or standout performances, one that you either casted or spectated? Was there a match that you look back on and go, wow, okay, like that match really stood out to me? Like this is one that was super important or just a super exciting match?
I think there were a couple. I think for High Point, they had a couple of defining games that they had to play at the end. Playing up against Concord Maroon, they played up against the second Rutgers team, the Scarlet team, and then they also played up against LVC, who are no slouches in their own right.
Yeah.
That little stretch of 2 weeks is when I really was like, okay, if High Point's for real, they're going to be for real in these handful of games, and they were. But I think before that, as far as a specific match, I was always pretty hot on the main Colorado University team that wanted Colorado Boulder, the Colorado Black guys.
Yeah.
I thought that they were being criminally underrated, and they had a chance to play up against Cal State, and I had a chance to cast that match. It was a very competitive 4 games. An opportunity really kind of missed, I think, for Colorado overall. But that one I looked at and said, okay, these guys just proved themselves. They were undefeated up until they played up against Cal State. It's the last game of the split. Had to find a way to keep it competitive in my mind if they wanted to stay like around the top 10 in the rankings, and they did. There's an opportunity where I think they really could have actually taken that series, maybe even 3-0. I mean, there were a couple of rounds in search that should have gone their way. They kind of had a couple of follies and one of the hard points. But that team in specific, I think, is one that I'm keeping my eye out for, because for their run, they didn't really play anybody too difficult. Outside of playing up against the Oregon Green squad and then playing up against Cal State. But I think it's a team that could absolutely, they've got all the right components to put together a pretty solid run overall. So that team, I think, is one that sticks in the front of my mind. And then beyond High Point, I think you're looking at Texas overall. There's a lot of schools in Texas that are looking really good. And the same can be said about the Canadian schools as well. It's just like a weird collection of like schools around Texas and schools in Canada. They're all finding a lot of success. So anytime that they played up against each other, usually provided for a very entertaining match.
So, of course, we still have the regional qualifiers to decide our final 64 teams for the playoffs. So let's actually start there real quick. We have some teams sitting near the top of that regional qualifier with some FPS pedigree behind them. Of course, we have the GSU Eagles, North Texas, Arizona State, all sit near the top of that regional qualifier. Of the top teams across all the divisions, who do you think sits in the best spot right now to be able to make a push in the best possible seeding for the playoffs?
It's looking pretty convincing that the teams that are 5th and 6th, because we took the top 4 that automatically qualified. So the teams that finished 5th and 6th are probably going to have no problem getting through the teams that finish in the bottom. As much as we would love to think that there is a slim divide between the teams that were in the top cut versus the teams that were in the bottom cut from the first split to the second, which is how we had our schedule format. The divide wasn't that it wasn't that slim.
Yeah.
there were definitely, I mean, especially when you're looking at the number 5 team playing up against either the number 12 or number 13. You look back at the times that they played each other before, and they were smokehouse 3-0s. So you're probably expecting to see both the Arizona State teams make it through, Maroon and Gold, even though they both had really weird seasons. We don't even really know who their best team is overall. I think the argument would have to be Maroon because they beat Gold, but that's neither here nor there. The GSU team that you mentioned is their second team. They're very competitive. They're very good. They definitely should have no problem getting through. It just, for me, comes down to those regional qualifiers will be a really big chance, I think, for those teams between 7 and 11 to, if they really did improve in that second cut, that bottom cut, would they have a chance to upset one of those teams that they lost to prior in the first split? Which you're going to see some of those opportunities. I think you're looking at potential of, there's a 3-way in Oklahoma. You've got Oklahoma University, Tulsa, and Oklahoma State that have a potential of playing up against each other. I think this Navarro College team in Texas is really good. There's a lot of stories that are like that. But for the regional qualifiers, as much as we would love to build up a story that, we're going to get some really intense and incredible games, I think it's probably going to be pretty clear-cut as far as who's able to get through the regional quals to get into playoffs.
Well, so speaking of clear cut, I think we've kind of touched on them a little bit, but I think we'd be doing a disservice if we, of course, didn't talk about for a second the elephant in the room, and that is Ottawa University. 2 teams with top seeds, several players from both rosters sitting in the upper echelon in terms of stats on the leaderboards, and number 1 and number 2 in the latest power rankings from last week. So obviously these guys are a favorite to win it all, and understandably so, at least one of the teams is. And who do you think right now has the best shot of taking down one of these Ottawa teams in the playoffs?
Ooh, that's a tough question. So, I mean, looking over what the projection is going to be for their playoff brackets specifically, I have to find them again on here because there's so many teams in here. There's a potential where Ottawa Black would play up against the University of Illinois Orange team, which would be pretty good. That should be a pretty good matchup. And then you've got Cal State Long Beach that also will probably meet up against Ottawa Gold later on into the bracket. That should also be a pretty good one. Yeah. So, I mean, really when it comes down to who can actually beat these squads, it has to be one of the teams that's currently sitting in the top 10 in my mind. A lot of the teams that kind of fall below our top 10 in the top 25 rankings that we have some either very uncharacteristically close games versus teams they should not have close games versus, or they have losses versus other teams that are sitting in the top 5. And most of those losses are pretty convincing. You're looking at Concord, you're looking at Sheridan, you're looking at probably Georgia Southern, Cal State. Those guys probably have the best bet at taking down one of those 2 Ottawa schools. They're definitely not unbeatable, that's for sure. It just comes down to, I mean, you look at what the schedule was for both the gold and the black teams. They didn't play anybody that was inside the top 10. Yeah. I mean, the closest they had was Ottawa Black played up against University of Northern Iowa. At the time, they were rated like top 12, but that's not the same as the top 5 in the CCL. Right. So I think it has to be one of those squads that I kind of just prior mentioned. Maybe an opportunity for like a Humber Gold to come in, depending on how the bracket looks. But it's not going to happen until like winter semifinals is probably what we're looking at here. Or maybe even the chance that if they do both meet up against each other, they would probably be taking maps, obviously, off of each other. For sure. But that's not to sit there and say that they're untouchable, because I think there are teams that are below them that can absolutely take maps and potentially even a series off either of those schools if they're not prepared.
Yeah, it's just going to be all matchups and see exactly how that bracket shakes out, which of course we'll know once the regional qualifier bracket is done. But so from what you've seen so far, what maps are going to be big deciders here? Because of course, a lot of the top teams are rolling through maps regardless. But let's take Purdue Gold for example. They have a pretty impressive performance in all maps, with the exception of Moscow Search and Destroy, where they drop almost half of the rounds that they play, or half of the games that they play on that map. Now, is that something that's going to be a problem for teams across the playoffs, generally speaking, or is the map pool relatively balanced?
For those that know the CCL and know me, I have to have a little jab to say, well, that's just Purdue Search and Destroy in a nutshell. But no, last year was a really indicative factor of who was most prepared, because largely the teams that were able to find upsets or continue on runs that maybe were unexpected was largely because they were just more prepared on every single map. And there were some teams that were out there that were going back, doing the homework and sitting there and saying, what maps do these guys like to play? Let's make sure they don't get to play them. Because for a lot of the schools that were out there last year, they were playing 2 hard points, 2 search and destroys, and 1 domination. That has not really been the case so much this year. I feel like teams are a little bit more diversified in their map pool. But the thing about it is, those stats that you would have had to last year go really kind of siphoning through everyone's schedule to find and then inputting them manually, all that's on the website now. Yep. So all of that's super easy for teams to find out. So I don't really want to say there's a particular map or mode that's going to determine. I still do believe the teams that are best at search and destroy will have the best chance, because largely, like you mentioned, the teams that are at the top, they just run through their opponents in respawn modes because they're just individually better. So the teams that can be competitive against the top squads in hardpoint, but then maybe have an edge in search, they have a really huge advantage when it comes to trying to extend their run, because flat out, a lot of the people that play in CCL 8s or they play scrims, they don't scrim search and destroy. They're just playing respawns all the time. So I naturally find an advantage to teams that are great at search, and I naturally find advantage to teams that are very well versed, no matter what map they find themselves on. Even just rehearsal reps, if they find themselves, let's say that they're 1 in 5 on a particular search, hey, they've played that, there's an opportunity for them to hopefully grow in that. that's a huge advantage, I think, when it comes to playoffs overall, especially when you're going up against squads that maybe did not take the regular season as seriously and are now going to be late to the party preparing for other maps or other modes that they didn't have as much rehearsal on throughout the regular part of the season.
For sure, especially when we're talking about, best of 5 series, where you're going to see a lot of these game modes, several times in a series, especially against similar type of opponents. Like, if what you're saying, if you're seeing teams that are only playing respawns, like, you're going to see that several times throughout the course of a bracket. So, anything can shake out once you have to play the same couple things multiple times in a series.
Right.
So, last question for you: playoff predictions, just general. Who's coming out victorious? Who's going to underperform? And what is your hottest CCL take going into this bracket?
The top 2 favorites are absolutely the Ottawa schools.
Sure.
I would be surprised if those were not the 2 schools that played in the grand finals, no matter which one went down to lowers and came back up to grands. That's probably going to be your grand finals.
Agreed.
There's opportunity for upsets. We've seen that. Last year, Full Sail was in people's top 4, and they finished like top 12, something like that. I don't remember. But there is opportunity for upsets to occur. I think the team with the biggest upside potential to surprise teams this year would be the Florida E4 Knights. I think they've got a really solid team overall. They played Georgia Southern really close, but they also got sent Nat 5 versus that Bama squad that I think is just being overweighed by just one single person. So I wouldn't be surprised if the E4 Knights made a little bit of a stretch, made a bit of a run. Outside of that, as far as underperforming, I think that would have to come down to where current expectations are for certain squads.
For sure.
So I'm kind of looking in the middle of the pack. I think for Ohio State, they're currently, in a pretty solid spot overall, technically undefeated, but they haven't really played anybody. And I think that could potentially be an upsetting portion for them, is that they go into a pretty decent opponent and they get surprised. And they could possibly find themselves in the lower bracket earlier than I think some other teams that are kind of around them in my ranking based on where their seeds currently are for the playoff bracket. And then I think there are schools that are on the outside of our top 25 looking in. I think Arizona is a team that could potentially still make a bit of a run. They were very successful in one of the TESPA tournaments that happened during the offseason. Had a little bit of a shaky start at the beginning of this year, but to be fair, they played some pretty tough opponents in the Pacific, and that's to kind of be expected. So if they've grown from that and have built from that, I think they could possibly be one of those teams kind of on the outside, maybe with the potential to upset some teams on the in.
Awesome, man. Well, yeah, Shift, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. Obviously, your knowledge of the COD community and the COD space and the game itself is always immense and a pleasure to hear about. For all of our CCL fans watching this, they're undoubtedly going to see you again here in a couple days and over the course of the next week. But for everyone else, where can they find you online and see more of what you do?
Yeah, I'm at IHOLDSHIFT at just about everything, but I definitely do encourage anyone who's watching, whether they're in high school looking to get involved with collegiate competing in Call of Duty or any kind of esport, or if you're currently a college student, you didn't know about this, definitely tune in to what we have to go with at twitch.tv/CollegeCOD. We also will have a Bravo channel, a Charlie channel, and a Delta channel. So many games that are going to be going on. We got to try to find a way to cover it. It's really going to feel like March Madness out here. So hopefully you guys can all check in with that. You can find their website at collegecod.com as well, which has a lot of that information too.
Awesome. Thanks again, Shift.
You got it.
Well, that'll do it for this episode of The Charge. As always, we want to direct you to the events page at Stay Plugged In so you can find out how to join our 12 titles here for Carry to College series. That's espin.gg/events to check out more information, or you can go to Twitter at stay_plugged_in, and that'll have the information you need and keep you up to date on all things Stay Plugged In.
That's right. All that information will be down in the description below, so make sure you sign up. Carry to College is going on right now as we speak. Yeah. Qualifiers are still happening, so don't miss your chance. That's right, 12 titles to sign up for, so be sure to keep up to date with that. You can find me on Twitter at HugeBoxTurtle.
And myself at BearlightGaming as well.
Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of The Charge, and remember, stay plugged in.